You may not have known San Angelo native James Ramirez when he was a Lakeview student in the early 2000s, but you probably know his work since.
I mean, luckily, my parents didn't think I was totally crazy and had saved up and bought me a computer, and I was able to just make some stuff. And that, being able to do stuff on my own. I mean, I was staying out of trouble, right? I wasn't doing anything bad. So, they just encourage that. And that's kind of that also that leap of faith of me saying, I'm going to go to art school when, nobody in my family had ever gone to, college. And so there was this kind of risk reward of doing something outside of the box and not really knowing what the career output was going to be.
Part of that career output would be working on some of Hollywood's biggest films, including the title sequences for the Oscar-winning Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse and last year's sequel, Across the Spider-Verse, which is also up for Best Animated Feature Film at Monday's Academy Awards ceremony.
It's kind of what's weird about my trajectory is there's a lot of people who end up in film and TV who, have those moments of seeing something a lot of my peers are I remember when I saw Star Wars in theaters and I knew what I was going to do. I didn't really have anyone around me who was into that type of art. And so everything that I was around was actually, kind of my friend Carlos introduced me to kind of hip hop. And with hip hop, there's all the different elements to it, like graffiti and breakdancing and DJing and all that stuff. And that culture and, lowriding culture were the two things that I pulled from. There really wasn't this ambition to go towards film or even knowing that I could do something like that. I did a BFA program at the Kansas City Art Institute 4 years and graduated in 2005. During school, a professor, again, I didn't know anything about, that kind of field, or realizing that was an actual job path. And somebody had said, hey, there's these guys who started a studio who went here and, they're kind of doing some of the things that I think you'd be interested in. So you should do an internship with them. And so I did an internship, and that led to me pestering them basically as soon as I was done with, my studies. And then, I started writing immediately after, the next week after I graduated, I started with them full time. So, I mean, to be honest, I've kind of managed to, I think that mentality of working with smaller places is kept with me. And I usually work with really small teams, which is kind of surprising to a lot of people. Everyone thinks, big Hollywood projects or whatever, that these massive teams, and it's really never the case. I really mostly work with small teams of people, and we kind of do a lot. I think it's interesting to do conceptual and narrative work that's kind of a part of a bigger, structure or film. And I find that the most gratifying to contribute to that type of work versus I do a lot of broadcast and, commercial stuff, but, it's usually a 30-second spot for a toothbrush or a golf club or something. And it's kind of a throwaway, but, and it's great to keep honing your skills and working on it, because you can always learn. But the title sequence stuff, I find the most, creatively engaging to me. And so I've tried to pursue that for the past, 3 or 4 years. It's what I've mostly focused on. But that work is kind of, there's a lot of people who are after that work. So it's definitely a competitive market, and it's, it's I try to balance it out with other work when I don't have, in my downtime, I guess I should say. It's, it's one of those things where when I first was freelancing it, you definitely have this fear of where's the next paycheck coming from? But I mean, over time, you basically realize that you develop enough relationships and there's enough demand for the type of work that I do that I pretty much stay busy and don't have to worry about it. And so I'm really thankful for the opportunities that I've been given. And, it's building relationships with studios that I like working with, and then they come back and, we do projects together. So it's kind of just been about, finding my niche and what I like doing, but also being really comfortable in the type of work I do. Sometimes there's that kind of imposter syndrome of there's so many artists out there, anyone can do what I do, but it's just trying to find your voice in what you do and just having fun with it and never taking it too serious or having an ego. And I think most people are willing to like bring you back, usually, especially on the bigger films, you're being brought in early. And so things are developing. The stories are, the story arcs are changing, the, character progression or how they want to end their film changes. And so you're kind of constantly like in a state of flux, just working with them to like get something out in time for your deadline, but also like, making sure you're as malleable as possible for the creative process. And so they're working on their thing, they're trusting you to do your thing, and then they're, supporting us by giving us access to assets or feedback or including us in the kind of creative process. I've always been X-Men and Spider-Man were kind of my jam growing up. So it's always interesting to see things that you're interested kind of chase you years later and come back and be something that's a part of your work. I mean, same thing with like video games. I've played video games so much of my life, and that has excitement level like gets to peak up every now and then. I got to work on like Uncharted, and I played all the Uncharted games, and so it's funny when you're in a meeting and they're like, so we're gonna do this movie for Uncharted. You're like, yeah, I played all the games, and they're like, oh wow, really? And so it's fun when that kind of like your normal life casual stuff that you're just inspired by kind of comes back into your work. And I mean, getting to work on these animated films, like I never thought I would get to work on such a big film. I mean, the first one won an Oscar, and this one just got nominated for an Oscar. And so it's like it's really cool to be able to collaborate with people on such it to me it's just a basic level, just friends making stuff with friends, but it ends up being these kind of like bigger projects. And so yeah, I'm very fortunate. I didn't read the script on the Spider-Verse movies, but I mean, we're kind of brought in and we're looking at a rough edit, so it's kind of the entire film, so you're seeing all of the story beats and what's the progression of what's going to happen. And so we're kind of like really trying to figure out the narrative for what we're doing and how it works with what they're doing. And in this, like in the last case for Across the Spider-Verse, it was really challenging because it's a bridge between two films, and that was challenging because the audience is leaving the theater with your visuals. So like how their movie ends is kind of like this climactic cliffhanger, and then you're left to kind of like wrangle that. And so that was really challenging for us in figuring out how you want the audience, what feeling you want them to walk away with. You don't want them to be bummed out and sad, that things don't seem like they're going to work out. You kind of want this like hopeful, message. And so it's like trying to find the balance, with everyone. And I think that's what we did. Narratively, we worked on a lot as we were developing that sequence. It took a lot of edits and revisions to kind of find that balance and that story. Because sometimes title sequence can just be flashy nonsense. You're just kind of making pretty pictures. But I think what we really strive to do is find those threads that are really interesting and kind of like really marry together a sequence that is a part of the film and helps tell the story and engages the audience. And those are more challenging to do because they're not just frosting on the cake. We went into the meeting with the directors and they said, we're really trying to figure out how to like deconstruct a comic book and put that on the screen. And when you hear that, you're kind of like, yeah, okay, sure, I get it. You're going to put panels and do the tropes from the comics, but really, like, I think that they took it in such a way where they were really pulling at the pieces and the seams and figuring out like how can you really like use animation as a medium to explore what the comics are able to do so well. And it's like, and I think that they found this like really playful and immersive way of storytelling that I think really after the first Spider-Verse film came out really kind of affected the trajectory of all of their animated films. I think everyone kind of realized that you can be playful and explore what the medium can do without being hindered by always trying to recreate what live action does. There's no need to like be constrained to the real world like live action films do, and you can you have this open tapestry to be really creative. And I think that was a really hard brief to walk into, to say like, well, what do you do that visually to like stack up to this like masterpiece that they're making? But you kind of just have to try to embrace things and kind of break your brain and try to find a new way to approach the visuals. And so I think with both of the sequences, they're very different sequences and approaches, but I think we were very successful in just embracing, very like tactile, analog type um, qualities in the visuals, and then kind of breaking it down into a way that um, felt like it was also a part of the story. Again, back to the storytelling, it's like the process is a part of that, and you don't want to break from what they're doing, but it also you can't just mimic them because they want something different. But it's like finding the balance between celebrating kind of animation through all of its stages, from cell drawing to film to early photography. It's like all of those things. How can you play with that and create a sequence out of that? And it's kind of the challenge. On Wednesday, I did that with the studio called Filmograph, and on that one, they had gone through like the design process. So they had gone through a couple of rounds with the showrunners and figuring out what the aesthetic was. But yeah, you kind of want to lean into like Tim Burton's aesthetic, and because it hits such a fingerprint to his films, and so how do you pay homage to his past work, but also explore something that feels like it's a breath of fresh air into it. And so I think that we tried to find visual motifs that we could like, play with that would explore that. And to me, like that was like spirals. And so I played a lot with like, in the edit itself, like how do, spirals and the camera work kind of embody this sense of like almost a bit of eeriness, because you're kind of like going through the sequence and you're seeing these very kind of abstracted images, but you're kind of finding the things that you think are part of that work, but finding your fresh way of like bringing it to the table. And I think that's always like the challenging part, because you want to be as experimental and exploratory, but also there's source material that you're kind of beholden to in a way. I think that is a series that, is a much harder series to approach, to give your voice to, because it has this like legacy of like what it looks like and what people expect of them. Um, but yeah, I mean, just, some of the team at MK12, I mean, that was their dream. Like they had grown up watching those sequences and, were huge fans of, Bender and Robert Brownjohn and Kleinman, who had done all the sequences before. And so I think MK12 was like the second outside company from the UK to touch the franchise. And so I think Robert Brownjohn was the first, and then MK12s, and no one. And then it went back to Kleinman. He's done all of them since. But yeah, that was a really, really hard sequence. I mean, that was at the time too. We also got tasked with doing a bunch of visual effects shots throughout the film. So all of the smart tables, tablets, phones, smart wall. There was like so many like screen kind of graphics that we were doing throughout the film. And so it was really challenging for a small shop in the Midwest of like, 9 people to work on that big of a project for, I mean, that was like a full year that we put into that. And so it was really fun, but it was definitely really challenging. And, I was more junior at the time, so I was really heavily leaning on, their experience and filmmaking like ideas to kind of like figure out how to work within the constraints that we had. But yeah, that definitely is like bucket list for most people, getting to work on a Bond film. I'm at a fortunate place to where I can kind of like pick and choose which jobs I take now. And so it's like filling the time in between films with some commercial work and then jumping on title sequences when I can.